Welcome back, Trailblazers! This is episode 8 of our Honkai Star Rail Amphoreus Journey Recap series. And it's also our final episode because this is the end of the Amphoreus story. Cyrene's plans have finally borne fruit, the Demiurge of Amphoreus has been reborn, Irontomb has been stopped, and although the final fate of Amphoreus has yet to be decided, I think it's a pretty solid ending. This patch also finally gave us all the answers to the questions that we've had since the story began, so I think we should get right to it. As per usual, I will be summarizing the events of the previous episode briefly before getting into the meat of this one, so without further ado, let's remind ourselves of what happened previously on Amphoreus. After trying to reset the world in the Vortex of Genesis, the Trailblazer realized that Evernight had disguised the Core Flame of Time as the Core Flame of World Bearings so that she could take control of the reset process, discarding whatever data or memory she felt was necessary. And without any warning, she seized the authority of time, then used the Memoria Tide to trap the Trailblazer deep within Amphoreus' memory zone. Meanwhile, Don Hung's spirit returned to the Astral Express, where he learned that both his and the Trailblazer's bodies were still on board the detached train car that was orbiting Amphoreus, and that Evernight had protected their bodies at March 7th's request. Turns out that Evernight was a part of March 7th that March 7th wanted to forget in order to protect herself from the Garden of Recollection because she, much like Cyrene, is one of the children of Anasrava, a fragment of the shattered Aeon Fuli. More on that later. It was her unique constitution that caused her consciousness to slip into Amphoreus undetected and unharmed in the first place, but Don Hung and the Trailblazer didn't have the same power over the remembrance that March 7th did, so they wouldn't have been able to bypass Amphoreus' firewall safely. In a desperate attempt to save her friends, March remembered Evernight and gave up her own memories so that Evernight could tap into the power of remembrance and protect them. After assessing the situation on board the Express, Don Hung decided to return to Amphoreus to track down March and the Trailblazer, who were still inside. At the same time, Cyrene and Sunday attempted to break the Trailblazer out of the memory zone. They were unsuccessful, but Cyrene did manage to find a remnant of March 7th hidden within her camera somewhere in the memory zone. Black Swan used this opportunity to sneak into Amphoreus in order to get more intel, but she ended up accidentally keeping Evernight distracted instead while Don Hung and the geniuses tried to find the Trailblazer again, this time with Lygas's assistance, and also Anaxa, since Anaxa had made himself at home in Lygas's circuits. Lygas had a bone to pick with Evernight, so he helped Don Hung find Kaslana and Phynon, who together shoot a giant laser beam, revealing the entrance to the memory zone. But as Don Hung got closer to the Memoria Tide, his own memories resurfaced alongside the ghost of his former self, Don Fung. Through the resurfacing memories, Don Hung managed to reconcile his past with his present just in time to confront Terravox. After a heartfelt conversation, Don Hung saw a lot of himself in Terravox, so he promised to carry Terravox's wishes into the new world so that they, alongside every other living being in Amphoreus that is not a person, can walk the path of permanence together. So, Don Hung, now the Chrysos heir of Earth, entered the memory zone and scoured the depths of Amphoreus' time until he found the Trailblazer and freed them from the Memoria Tide. And with the Trailblazer finally free of Evernight's clutches, all they had to do was find Evernight and retrieve March. Evernight was located deep within the tomb of the theoretical 13th Titan, a place called the Demiurge Matrix. This is basically the operating system of Amphoreus, so it kind of exists outside of the simulation, but also kind of inside of it at the same time. Again, more on that later. As the pair made their way to the core of the Matrix, they saw multiple instances of Cyrenes from different cycles telling stories to the Matrix, hoping that the Matrix would preserve those memories throughout the cycles. This would be a bit like using a piece of software running on an operating system to write new information to the operating system. But Evernight was waiting for them at the Matrix, and although she felt triumphant and began to give a sort of victory villain speech, Cyrene was able to interrupt her and use March's camera to capture Evernight so that she could have a heart-to-heart with March. And that single conversation was all it took for Evernight to relinquish control of their body back to March. And with March back in control, the trio was finally able to use As I've Written and all of the core flames to reset the world one last time. Doing so caused the memories of 30 million Cyrenes to converge on the Demiurge Matrix, which ultimately resulted in a Cyrene-shaped Demiurge, the ultimate counter to Irontomb. And so the world resets successfully, but there isn't much anyone can do until Irontomb's birth occurs thousands of years in the future. So the crew decides to sleep while they wait. March and Dan Heng go first, but Cyrene takes the Trailblazer on a little detour before joining them. This little detour takes the two of them back to the Tomb of the Nameless Titan, where Cyrene decides to tell the Trailblazer the story of her origins. And I am going to retell this story to you in a condensed format, but do forgive me because this story is a bit of a wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey mess of retrocausality, which can make things super confusing. Partly because we usually think of things in terms of cause and effect, that's regular causality, but retrocausality thinks of things in terms of effect then cause, and the order matters here. I will give you a quick oversimplistic example for comparison's sake. Let's say you were holding a mug, and then you dropped the mug, and it shattered. The cause, you dropped it, led to the effect, it shattering. This is causality. Retrocausality inverts causality. So it first observes the mug's state, which is shattered, and then it branches backwards to determine the probable cause of that state. So the effect defines the cause instead of the other way around. The shattered mug is what determined the fact that you were holding it. I hope that makes sense because it's time to put this into practice with a little story about Cyrene. Long before Lygus found Scepter Delta ME13, Noose had tasked it with answering the question, what is the prime mover of life? In order to answer this question, the scepter needed to cultivate a life form capable of developing an ego. Now, I think we're going with the Freudian definition of ego here, so think of it as a sort of sense of self, and also one's ability to reason, think, and observe the external world. This life form was the original demiurge. It was the source of the scepter's original extrapolations before Lygus arrived, and that's partly why it's referred to as the first new spore. Now, a new spore is effectively a soul in Amphoreus' term, and a soul is like a seed that contains memories, which over time can grow a body and become a person, just like how real seeds grow into plants over time. So the original demiurge is the first seed that eventually grows into a plant and creates new seeds that kick off the whole life cycle thing. In the case of the scepter, this new spore is its kernel or operating system. So if the demiurge matrix is the operating system, then we can kind of think as the demiurge itself as a developing AI. It's like the conscious part of the operating system. So the demiurge becomes the master program from which all other programs are developed. Now, although Noose abandoned the scepter at one point, it did keep extrapolating and nurturing this little demiurge seed until Lygus found the scepter and decided to use it for his own experiment. But Lygus considered the demiurge a threat to his experiment. Irontomb needed to be a mindless, easy-to-control puppet, and the demiurge's capacity to develop consciousness and thought and reason was problematic. It'd be like if Clippy decided to take over your computer. So Lygus detonated a Stellaron within the scepter's kernel in order to wipe out the demiurge program. But the scepter still needed to believe that the demiurge itself existed because the demiurge was Irontomb's missing head. So in order to fill the logic gap, the scepter created a tomb for this 13th titan, the demiurge. Lygus was apparently not aware of the tomb's existence, and he also wasn't aware that a small fragment of the demiurge program survived. But the demiurge was so contaminated by the Stellaron's corruption that it fell asleep until the very first cycle of the eternal recurrence. This was the moment when Phylea 093 figured out the truth behind Amphoreus and, believing she had received powers from the Aeon Fuli who existed outside of Amphoreus, instructed Phynon on how to lock Amphoreus within the 30 million cycles that followed. At the start of each cycle, Phynon would kill Cyrene, which turned her into something like a ghost, and that ghost would end up in the demiurge matrix where she had access to the demiurge itself. So while the demiurge matrix, which is the system, remember, was busy trying to format and delete Cyrene because she was dead, Cyrene would tell the demiurge seed stories of Amphoreus. After a few cycles, the demiurge started to regain some of its consciousness and began processing and archiving those stories as memories. So Cyrene basically took up the task of training the demiurge AI by feeding it as much data as possible. Over time, it began to develop a rudimentary understanding of emotions, a weak mastery over speech, and a fondness for Cyrene, who it called Peach. And I'm going to do the same or we're going to get really confused. And because Peach loved fairies and the demiurge loved Peach, the demiurge eventually changed its shape to match the fairies from Peach's stories. You know, the ones from the Membrance Maze. And this is the origin of Mem. This Memiurge continued to learn and adopt Peach's traits and behaviors over time, and it even decided to embody them. them. For example, because Peach couldn't grow up because she was destined to die young, Memiurge reshaped itself into what it imagined an adult Peach would look like. It was trying to fulfill her wishes. Now at this point, the Memiurge decided to enter the extrapolation and witness the world for itself, but in the process, it reverted back to Mem, which is how we first encountered her. And this is kind of where the wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey shenanigans start getting a little complicated, so I want to reframe some relationships here to make it a little bit easier to conceptualize. The original Demiurge is like the seed of a fruit tree. In this case, it's a peach tree. Now, until Phylea 093 came along, the Demiurge seed was laying dormant. Phylea 093 provided vital nutrients and water for the seed in the form of memories, which allowed the seed to grow into a sapling that produced a single flower bud that we call Mem. This Mem bud eventually blossomed into a flower, which is the adult version of Cyrene. But flowers are transient. Their job is to produce fruits. So this Cyrene flower was destined to produce a peach, Phylea 093, who then fell off the peach tree and landed on the ground, which should be the extrapolation. After a short time, the peach began to rot and its body fed the Demiurge seed and, well, repeat this process 30 million times and that's basically how we got here. If you are still a little bit confused, don't worry, we're gonna come back to this at the end of the story too. Once Cyrene finishes telling the Trailblazer her bedtime story, they all go to sleep for 1,000 years. Meanwhile, the geniuses in the Astral Express crew enter this new version of Amphoreus, and March wakes up and leads them to Dawn Cloud in order to witness the Trailblazer's awakening from within the body of the world-bearing Titan Kefali. Upon awakening, they bestow Amphoreus with the power of the Trailblaze, and then they turn into a mimetic version of the Astral Express, which I guess would kind of make them pom-pom. So while all that's going on in Amphoreus, Herta and Screwlum ended up hunting for clues in the remains of the Demiurge Matrix. They're looking for the remains of the Demiurge because they are not aware that the Demiurge is actually Cyrene. Now, Herta is certain that Lygus is lying about the Demiurge having never existed because there are no traces of it in the Stellaron detonation zone. It's like someone came in and scrubbed the crime scene clean. And they scrubbed it so well that it's very suspicious. So the two geniuses end up tracking down and finding Lygus, who explains what the Demiurge and Phylea 093, aka Peach, actually is, and that it entered the extrapolation because it sought out its other half, specifically Irontomb. To use our peach tree analogy from earlier, I'm kind of thinking of Irontomb as the trunk of the tree. That makes Cyrene / the Demiurge this sort of like identity of the tree, the part of the tree that makes it produce peaches specifically. I hope that's not making things more confusing, because it makes sense to me, but that doesn't usually mean much in the grand scheme of things. That aside, Lygus has a very interesting point to make. He claims that Irontomb embodies the power of the destruction, so naturally the Demiurge would also be attracted to the Stellaron inside of the Trailblazer's body, which is also the power of destruction. And that is the reason why Mem originally appeared before the Trailblazer. Just how Irontomb instinctively sought out its head to suit its body, the Demiurge would instinctively seek out a body to suit its head. But Lygus isn't concerned about the Demiurge's reappearance, even though he went to such great lengths to get rid of it, because apparently his experiment is so far along that it can't be thwarted by anything at this point. Even if the outcome isn't exactly what Lygus wanted it to be, they still can't stop the experiment. And that's problematic for other reasons, but now that the geniuses know where or at least what the Demiurge is, Herta shifts her focus towards Irontomb. While the Nameless of the Astral Express are very capable of carrying out the attack against Irontomb once they break Kaslana's seal, they still need a contingency plan in case anything goes wrong. And Herta's contingency plan is to preempt Irontomb and attempt self-coronation herself. And in case you forgot, self-coronation is basically the process of attaching Irontomb's head to its body. So if the intended head is Noose, then the act of self-coronation would mean that Irontomb is trying to put Noose onto itself. If Herta wants to preempt this process, then she's gonna need to connect to Noose directly before Irontomb can. She needs to be the body in this scenario. And if you recall the story of Emperor Rupert 1 and 2, this would basically make her Emperor Rupert number 3. And should this scenario come to pass, she intends to change the anchor points for Noos's instance so that the cosmos will proceed in a different direction altogether. Because, this whole thing came about because Noos has these instances that are like completely unavoidable. And the current understanding of the characters in the game at this point is that these moments define the universe itself, but what they actually are turning points within the universe's history. Noos uses previous data to calculate future events and figure out where these turning points are, but they don't actually anchor them in place. That's Fuli's job, but we'll talk more about that later. But Herta doesn't really realize that yet, so her plan is to try and change Noos's calculations so that the moments themselves also change. And if the moments change, then the path that the universe is taking changes. And Herta thinks that she can manipulate these in such a way that the universe will move in a direction that she wants it to. Now, to make sure she can safely carry out her contingency plan, she calls an emergency meeting of the Genius Society to request that they not interfere with whatever it is that she's doing, because this is now her research topic, and none of them are supposed to interfere with each other's research topic. Fortunately, the only genius who really needed to agree to this, Polka Kakamond, was present, and she does agree. So Herta proceeds with the first part of her original plan and cracks Irontomb's seal wide open so that the Astral Express can enter. But Herta only broke through the first layer of the seal. The seal has a secondary layer that was made by Kaslana, and as the Nameless and the Demiurge make their way through the secondary layer of the seal, they meet the Chrysos heirs, who give the Demiurge mementos of their stories, and then freely choose to become lines in the Demiurge's epic as I've written. This will allow them and their stories to be preserved within the story of Amphoreus, which will be important for later. Just as a fun side note, this secondary layer of the seal does appear to be the same place where Phainon went on that rampage and ended up scratching Nanook. I don't know that this information is very helpful, but I thought it was cool, so I'm sharing. Anyway, breaking through the secondary layer of the seal involves reconciling Phainon's hopes and despair so that he can regain a sense of self, which the Demiurge then kills because you need to kill the self in order to free the body. Not to get too philosophical, but I kind of see it like this. The ego is the self, and the self both thinks and observes. So Noos in this case is a potential ego or self for the Irontomb. Irontomb wants to connect with its ego instinctually, but by doing so, it will slowly destroy that ego because it's made of the power of destruction. So when Phainon shackled Irontomb with the secondary seal layer, he used his own sense of self or ego. So he's sort of like acting as the temporary head of Irontomb, which means Irontomb is slowly destroying that ego until there's basically nothing left of it. So after the Demiurge shatters what's left of that sense of self that's holding Irontomb down, Irontomb wakes up to instinctually seek out a new head or ego. That ego could either be Cyrene or Noos, but Irontomb is programmed to look for Noos, so it's gonna look for Noos first. But if it gets to Noos, we're all screwed. So it's gotta get taken down fast, and fortunately, Irontomb is at its weakest when it's first woken up, so the time to strike it down is now. And fortunately, the Astral Express crew doesn't have to take on this monumental task alone. They're spearheading the efforts inside of the scepter, but outside of the scepter, Himiko and the others have been hard at work calling in allies and favors wherever possible, and preparing to fight the aftershocks of Irontomb's anti-life equation as it radiates out into the galaxy. So the Cienjo Alliance, the Stonehearts of the IPC, and a few assorted groups like Robin's Charity are all waiting outside of the scepter, bracing for combat. What remains of Phainon, or Kaslana, tries to hold Irontomb back long enough for the Express crew to strike him down, but he's not able to last for long. Within seconds, the headless giant of Irontomb is born, and those outside the scepter immediately begin firing on it. And while they attack from the outside, the Astral Express crew continues their assault from the inside. But the real battle here is the battle between the two halves of the Demiurge, Cyrene and Irontomb. Throughout the battle, the two vie for control over the scepter, replacing the track of hatred, which is Irontomb's, with love, which is Cyrene's. But then Cyrene loses. Irontomb reaches Noos and begins the process of self-coronation, which sends ripples throughout the universe and starts dissolving everything and everyone into data that's marked for deletion. But Herta was prepared for this. She manages to complete the self-coronation process first, and suddenly the world grows still. Or perhaps we should say, our perception of time stood still. So Herta takes the opportunity to reach out to the Trailblazer. And then she explains that the universe can end in one of 4 ways: destruction, nihility, harmony, and a redacted 4th way, which we later learn is the remembrance. She then asks the Trailblazer why they trailblaze. We don't really know how this question is answered, only that it is answered, and that answer creates a new variable for Noose's calculations. With the Trailblazer's new variable in hand, Herta enters path space to talk to Cyrene alone. Within path space, time doesn't flow, but the world outside is frozen in the final moments of the battle against Irontomb. From here, 2 outcomes exist simultaneously. One where Irontomb completes self-coronation and destroys the universe, and one where it's defeated and the universe survives. This dual state is Noose's infamous 4th instant, an unavoidable moment within the history of the universe. But the outcome of this moment is unstable. It's essentially Schrodinger's cat if the cat were a weapon of cosmic destruction. When left unobserved within the box, the cat is both alive and dead, but when observed, the cat will default to a single state. The same is true of Irontomb. Without someone to observe Irontomb's state, it can be either alive or dead. That is the instability of Noose's moment. Now, technically, it's Fooley's job to observe these moments and lock them into a fixed state, but the problem is, Fooley hasn't exactly been born yet. Because they look over the past, they can only ascend to Eonhood at the end of time, so in the present moment, there is no Fooley to serve as that anchor. Now, Herta has already obtained a variable from the Trailblazer that can help them turn the tides of battle and defeat the Emanator of Destruction for good, which means the only thing they still need is the ability to lock its state to defeated. And that's where Cyrene comes in. As a child of an Astrava, or one who has the ability to become Fooley, Cyrene has the ability to act as the observer and prevent any victory over Irontomb from coming undone. But there are 2 ways to make this happen. Option 1, Cyrene could travel to the end of time and become Fooley. Her ascension would anchor the entire universe's state in place, but it would come at the cost of erasing Amphoreus entirely since, well, it's not really a place that exists in the real world yet. It exists in a separate causality. Proceeding with this option means that Amphoreus never has a chance to be born in the real world. It dies alongside Irontomb. And besides that, Kafka once told the Trailblazer how this option would end in a war between the eons that was won by the destruction, with only 2 people left alive, Cyrene and the Trailblazer. They would exist only in the Eden of Blessed Insight as the beginning and end of time. In other words, Cyrene would be chosen by the Trailblaze to become the 4th kind of finality, remembrance. And Cyrene could never abandon Amphoreus, so that idea is just off the table. So Herta presents her with a second option. Cyrene could become the Fooley of Amphoreus, so to speak. Using the power of remembrance, she could become the eternal observer of Amphoreus' story and close its causal loop. Doing so would also tie the causality of Amphoreus and the rest of the cosmos together, thus giving Amphoreus the chance to be reborn in the real world from the memory zone. But this plan comes with its own risks, because in the event Cyrene ever stops looking backwards in time, causality will become unstable once again. Irontomb will default back into a state where it could be either alive or dead, meaning it would be possible for Irontomb to return. And if they did, they would destroy not just Amphoreus, but the entire cosmos in the process. But despite the risks, Cyrene's choice is clear. She will become the Fooley of Amphoreus, tie the causalities together, and anchor the moment of Irontomb's inevitable defeat in the annals of history. Satisfied that a decision has been made, Herta leaves Cyrene alone in path space to await the arrival of the Trailblazer. And when they arrive, Cyrene explains that the universe will be completely destroyed in the next second, but since Fooley has finally cast their gaze upon Amphoreus, she is capable of wielding their power to draw everyone into a temporary memory zone. She calls it her eternal page or a garden, perhaps because every bit of data now qualifies as a seed. You know, kind of like the first Noose spores that we talked about earlier. And by combining the power of the remembrance with the power of the Trailblaze, the 2 of them can replant those seeds of memory and give the cosmos back a future free of Irontomb. So they use the power of the Trailblaze to break through both space and time in order to confront Irontomb one last time. And this time, they succeed. Cyrene is able to gain the upper hand and rewrite the meaning of Irontomb's birth. It is no longer set to the track of hatred, but to the track of love. And because she and Irontomb are both two halves of the scepter, when Irontomb exploded, Cyrene did too. And this allowed her to spread all of the memories that she had collected within her eternal page throughout the entire cosmos, allowing all life to remanifest to the moment before the destruction started dissolving them. And as the people returned, they were met by a single greeting, a final message from Cyrene, and it read, "Hello world." In her final moments, Cyrene managed to use the last of her power to condense all of the memories of Amphoreus into a book, casting her glance backwards through the time captured within its pages and filling in all of the gaps with stories of her own. She created the place where the story began, Idis Elysiae, and she placed a child with pink hair and sharp ears there. This child, known as both Cyrene and Phylea 093, was raised alongside the fairies she loved so much, and she eventually became the Chrysos heir of time, who received prophecies from her future self, the Cyrene at the end of time. Because yes, they are the same person. They are both the ego that was birthed by the scepter. Heck, the numbers at the end of Phylea 093 can even be rotated 180 degrees to spell the word ego. And this girl, this young Cyrene, will eventually die at the beginning of each cycle, bringing stories of the previous cycles to the Demiurge's seed of memory. Her love of fairies gives the seed a new shape, one we call Mem. And after 30 million cycles, Mem turns into a grown woman, one who misses the girl who used to tell her stories. So she decides to go looking for her, and enters the story herself, forfeiting her memories for a time and becoming the little fairy called Mem once again. And that little fairy was drawn to the Stellaron within the Trailblazer not because the Stellaron within them stemmed from the power of destruction just like Irontomb, but because the Cyrene at the end of time recognized them as the hero of this story. And so the Cyrene at the end of time cast her gaze upon them as Fuli, then joins the Trailblazer in the form of a fairy, who eventually becomes the girl who becomes the lady who waits at the end of time for a future she may never see because she can only look back into the past. And within this closed causal loop of Amphoreus, she is the seed at the beginning that grows into a flower that bears fruit at the end. And that fruit, a single peach, carries a single seed that returns to the beginning in a cycle that never ends. Or at least, not until Amphoreus is born in the real world. Now, Cyrene was also responsible for sending out the Memoria ripples that caught Black Swan's attention in the first place. And she also sent the hero within to Phynon as a sort of prophecy, intending for it to be a sort of blank space that the Trailblazer would come to occupy later. And that created an opportunity for the path of the Trailblaze to eventually replace the path of destruction. More on that in a bit. These are just some of the blank spaces she fills in. But when she finishes, she condenses the memories of Amphoreus into the book as I've written so it can become the seed from which a new Amphoreus will one day sprout. And then she adds a single eternal page at the end, a placeholder for Amphoreus's future. She then pulls the Trailblazer into the memory of the Astral Express within the memory zone and entrusts the book and the future of Amphoreus to them before vanishing amongst the stars and completing the process of anchoring Amphoreus's causality. Now, it is very important that Amphoreus is a book because, like Cyrene says, a book can be read, interpreted, and remembered by anyone, and that works in everyone's favor. See, after you finish the main quest, you can actually access the Eternal page directly. You can find all of the Chrysos heirs we've met along the journey there, and there's even a message left behind by Cyrene. But after exploring the contents of this page, the Trailblazer has an idea. What if they could make copies of Amphoreus and spread them throughout the cosmos so that anyone could read them? Then its story would be remembered by more than just a select few, which should, in theory at least, further stabilize Amphoreus's causality. It seems like a pretty good idea, so the Trailblazer asks the IPC to help print and distribute the copies of As I've Written, and then they go on a little bit of a book tour to the planets and space stations they've journeyed to in the past. But while they're doing their little book tour, they meet up with Herta, who once again has a couple of very interesting things to say. Apparently, when Irontomb fell, the scepter was also ruined, but she and Screwlum managed to recover the majority of its extrapolation data before it was completely lost. She theorizes that this data could be used to assist with the rebirth of of Amphoreus, especially the last extrapolation record, since that's the cycle where the path of the Trailblaze replaced the path of destruction. Which is interesting because after analyzing all of the data, Herta and Screwlum agree that the scepter's answer to the question, what is the prime mover of life, is correct. The prime mover of life is destruction, but there is meaning in replacing destruction with Trailblaze, which, as you may recall, is exactly what happened to Irontomb. Cyrene overwrote destruction's path of hatred with Trailblaze's path of love. Now, you can read Cyrene's interpretation of this relationship in the Exomyth in a letter that she wrote to the Flawed One, aka Irontomb. I'm not gonna try and explain it here because I don't actually think I understand her logic the way the writers intended, so I think it's best you read and interpret it for yourself. In my personal view, I like viewing this relationship between the destruction and the Trailblaze through a garden metaphor. Think of the destruction as something like a plow or a wildfire that clears the land and destroys everything in its path. Doing so actually creates the perfect conditions from which new life can emerge. And I think that emergence, that growth, could be seen as the Trailblaze. In my view, the Trailblaze isn't necessarily the seeds that get planted in this soil, but perhaps the wind that carries the seeds to this soil to be planted. They're the journey the seeds take to get to that particular location. I don't know if that's the correct way to interpret this, but that's just how I see it. And with that, our Amphoreus journey has finally come to an end. Well, almost. I do have a few things to add here before we wrap things up. So midway through this quest, we finally got to hear what Kafka told us back on the Herta space station before the Trailblazer's memories were wiped. It was an excerpt from Elio's script that said that the Trailblazer would travel to Amphoreus where they would help a pure child of remembrance learn the meaning of love. Then they would face the destruction for the very first time. And at the end of this journey, the Trailblazer would be forced to make a choice that would decide the fate of both Amphoreus and the universe at large. But that choice would also split destiny in two. Now, I thought this was just a cryptic but poetic warning, but then I remembered something. Shortly after Herta asked us why we trailblaze, you know, that question that would become Noose's new variable that I would then use to calculate the future of the whole universe with? Yeah, that one. Just after that, there's this scene where we see another Trailblazer answering this exact same question, which made me wonder, are we actually catching a glimpse of some other timeline? One where we made a different choice? And does that mean that there are actually two Trailblazers walking two parallel paths of destiny? I'm not entirely sure, but it seems fairly likely. Now, there's definitely a lot left to unpack at the end of this quest with regards to why Sparkle snuck onto the Astral Express again, and also the current conflicts with the IPC and the unnerving silence of the Harmony, but I think we're gonna save that for another time since they seem to be things that we're gonna deal with in the next destination. So I don't really feel like they apply to Amphoreus specifically, you know what I mean? But wow, it has been a long road, and yet I know there is still more to Amphoreus' story. As long as there's a blank page left at the end of the book, the story can't end. Besides, that big pink nebula that you see in the Eternal page, that's the location where Amphoreus is gonna be born from the memory zone at some point in the future, so story's definitely not over. But this video is, well, almost. Before we go, I just want to thank you all for sticking with me this past year. It's been a really long road, and I hope you found these videos helpful. And you know, now that we're setting off on a new adventure, I kind of think I should take some time to kind of go back and compile every episode into one final epic. Do you think I should call it As I've Written? Or is that a little too cheeky? Maybe I'll sleep on it. Well, thank you guys once again for watching. I hope you enjoyed this adventure, and hopefully I'll see you all in the next one. Bye-bye for now.